We are working our way through a series of lessons entitled The Church in the Late Modern World. However, it seems appropriate to pause the series for a week in order to address a growing tumult in our society, and in particular the effect it's having, or at least I perceive it's having, upon the household of faith. Given our nation's postmodern mood, I face a bit of a dilemma this morning, because according to critical theory, my membership in the oppressor class as a white male conservative heterosexual Christian means that I have no moral authority to speak on the issue of race. Intersectionality demands my silence. And yet at the same time, I have been told repeatedly that white silence is white violence. And so it seems either way I face vilification, whether I speak or I don't. But given my fondness for my own opinion, I think it's fortunate for all of you that I'll seize the opportunity that I do have, while I have it, to vent a little bit my spirit this morning. Our text is Romans chapter 2, verse 1. Romans 2:1, which says, "Therefore you have no excuse, O man, every one of you who judges. For in passing judgment on another, you condemn yourself, because you, the judge, practice the very same things." The death of George Floyd has managed to push into the foreground a cultural narrative concerning race which took academia decades to inculcate into our nation's collective unconscious. And it's one which is beginning to capture the imaginations of many Christians, it seems. It's a story of prolonged oppression and devastating hardship which begins at our nation's founding. As Timothy Dalrymple recounts the narrative, which he does in an article in Christianity Today, and it's an article which endorses this particular narrative, as he recounts it, he writes, "There was a virus present in the very environment that nurtured and developed our country, our culture, and our people. This virus is racism, and it has infected our church, our constitution and laws, our attitudes and ideologies. And even when the symptom of slavery ceased, the disease remained and mutated into other forms of oppression, like the racial segregation of Jim Crow, the terror of lynchings, the systematic discrimination of redlining, and on we could go." Now, if we pause this prevalent narrative at this point, I would imagine that all Christians are in agreement so far, at least for the most part. There's some loaded language that Dalrymple uses that we might want to push back on. But the point is that no one would want to deny or even diminish the glaring atrocities of chattel slavery, nor the decades of discrimination that followed its abolition. And this would include embracing some ugly truths concerning the role many Christians played in these collective sins. One could even affirm from Scripture that preceding generations bear a responsibility to try and repair any damage that has been done by the sins of their ancestors. Leviticus 26:41, for example, speaks of making amends for such iniquity. A controversy does exist, however, in the narrative's conclusion. According to Dalrymple, these racial injustices have left a deep bruise in the collective consciousness of the black community, the effects of which we see today in economic disparity and social disorder. But not only are the past sins of racism hindering the prosperity of blacks, but present prejudice enshrined in the apparatus of government makes success impossible without the intervention of whites. Now, in order to clarify the point that he's making, Dalrymple uses a metaphor that he borrows from Wendy Doniger. A metaphor where two explorers enter into a cave that's filled with the most elaborate spider webs. While one of the explorers rejects the existence of a spider because he can't see one, the other infers its existence from the presence of the webs. Dalrymple then concludes, racial prejudice is the implied spider that has woven the web of policies and practices, iniquities and abuses that have constrained Black Americans now for 400 years. If we set aside the forcedness of the metaphor, it seems to me that this kind of argumentation, which draws a direct inference from current disparity in the black community to racial causality, is one that's very fashionable in the broader social justice movement. And it's also one which is very fallacious. For it simply says, after this, therefore because of this, what in Latin is known as post hoc ergo propter hoc, which of course is a non sequitur. Just because the black community is in a state of disarray doesn't necessarily mean that the sole or even main cause is institutional racism. For while there are not many alternative explanations for how the spider web got into the cave, this is not the case for the lack of prosperity among blacks today, as many black intellectuals like Thomas Sowell and Wilfred Riley have pointed out for decades. This way of reasoning is also historically reductionistic, conflating what is no doubt a multivalent problem into a simplistic monocausal one. History, however, especially that which spans 400 years, is rarely this tidy. Such simple historical explanations, while making for good sermonizing and easy solutions, usually makes for bad historiography and bad long-term fixes. This may be part of the reason why the list of demands that we find from the Black Lives Matter organization, an organization that is clearly driven by this woke narrative, this may be part of the reason why that list of demands is so one-dimensional. Rename buildings, tear down statues, defund the police, give us money. It's essentially what they ask for. They seem not to have any idea of what to do beyond the current protest. A myopia confirmed in recent interviews with leaders of the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, or CHAZ, or CHOP, or whatever we want to call the current group that's occupying 6 blocks of downtown Seattle. And now that the broader movement is beginning to devour the universities which spawned them, much like Saturn castrating his father Kronos, it seems to me that they will have even less direction. Similarly, I've noticed that if you ask someone for a specific and current example of systemic racism, so that we might all rally around its anathematization, the advocate then becomes suspiciously silent. In other words, there seems to be a conceptual problem when it comes to this idea of systemic racism. Because they want to say that it's not individual racism, it's not just one individual person's bias towards a particular race. And they also want to say that it doesn't entail particular laws and policies, but rather that it entails some third category. Although historically, since this word came into existence, it's been very difficult to nail down exactly what that third category is. And it's become sort of this nebulous concept. What is also common in the social justice warrior rhetorical method, what I will call the SJW rhetorical method, is for this particular non sequitur argument to be accompanied by ad hominem attacks. This is sort of the 1-2 punch of postmodern pomposity. They tenderize you with how terrible a person you are, hoping to distract you so that they might land a knockdown blow with their feeble argument. The tactic seems to be to try and fill you with so much self-loathing that you give up on reason altogether and lay down voluntarily. Of course, if this doesn't work, they will try to scare and shame you into compliance by destroying your reputation, your career, your family, etc. And here's the thing, we see this relentless jab now being thrown by woke Christians at their sleepy kinsmen. There are numerous examples of this in Dalrymple's article. Again, this article comes from Christianity Today, which is the flagship publication of evangelicalism. But I noticed one of these jabs even in the theme passage of the article, which is Genesis 4:10. If you remember, this is God speaking to Cain, "Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." In other words, this article seems to be associating current Christians, not slave owners in the antebellum South, but current disciples with Cain, one of the great villains of the Bible, who killed his brother because he resented his righteousness and then lied about it to God. Cain, the archetype of ruinous resentment. It seems to me that this association is extravagant. Even if this supposedly hard to find, like the spider, systemic racism exists, are we really to believe that our white privilege, or at least my white privilege, and that implicit racism is morally equivalent to the depravity of Cain? This seems to me to be at best a verbal indulgence, and at worst a manipulative overstatement. Or have we now reached the point in our prosperity where microaggressions are equivalent to murder? I'm hoping that I've actually missed the point of the theme passage altogether for unity's sake. However, things get worse in a second example. Here Dalrymple appeals to the story of Phalaris, the tyrant of classical antiquity, who became infamous by roasting his enemies alive in a bronze bull, which converted their screams into the sonorous sound of a bellowing ox. Thus, a guest could recline at the feast, utterly unaware that the source of his entertainment was the suffering of others. Dalrymple then applies the analogy. Quote, "We have all benefited not only from their," and he means black people, "from their labor, but also from their innovations and entrepreneurialism, their art and music, their films and poetry and books, their hymns and preaching. The transformation of black suffering into economic abundance for America, as well as art and passion and brilliance, has enriched our feast in the palace. Perhaps we can honestly say we did not know what our brothers and sisters were suffering, now we do. So there's only one thing to do: put down our forks and get our brothers and sisters out of the belly of the bull." Again, the question is not whether there was great suffering in the past. All Christians must acknowledge this. The question concerns what's happening now. And all will agree that racism still exists. And all, I think, would also agree that in at least one sense, being black in America is different than being white in America. Because the numbers make it clear that there are many disadvantages to being black. There is less economic and educational opportunity, and greater chances for incarceration, drug abuse, death, and even in certain subgroups, the odds are against you that you will even make it out of the womb. The question is not whether there is a crisis in certain segments of the black community, but what is the cause of the crisis, and therefore what is the solution? And if the cause has more to do with the breakdown of the family, it's more of a crisis of responsibility, which Christians have thought for decades, than it does with some nebulous idea of institutional racism or systemic racism, which, as we will note, if the Lord wills, in a future lesson, is a concept that's rooted in postmodern theology and ideology. If it has more to do with the family than it does institutional racism, then it's not correct. It's utterly unfair to say that Christians have been deaf to the cries of their black brothers and sisters. White Christians have spent vast amounts of resources offering financial assistance, counseling, drug rehabilitation, prison outreach programs, adoption, and on we could go. Now, I understand that this, especially at this time, sounds horrible coming from someone that looks like me. It sounds boastful. I'm revealing my white privilege. I'm being insensitive to the plight of black people. But to be honest, I feel a little bit like the Apostle Paul. I'm absolutely losing my mind over this. We are living in a time of such madness that I have no choice but to state what should be obvious. And let me state something else that I think is obvious, but that many Christians are missing. It's not as if using systemic racism as the foil for every problem in black America is without consequence if you're wrong. It's not some sort of safe position to take. Because if in reality the problem is a crisis of responsibility, and you continue along the path of saying, no, it's actually some sort of racism that's difficult to pin down, in which that's the only problem there is, then you're going to be feeding bitterness and resentment and dependency where none belongs. You'll be doing exactly the opposite thing that you need to do in order to fix the problem, which means the problem will only get worse. In a sense, if you're wrong, then your actions are very unloving, not loving at all. My plea this morning to my fellow brothers and sisters in Christ is for us to tone down the rhetoric, to lay aside the histrionics and judgmental attitudes that are prevalent in our age, the bronze bull metaphors and all, and instead reason together as the Bible commands us to do. Don't malign my character by explaining away my beliefs as me being blinded by my white privilege, and I won't dismiss your beliefs based upon assumptions which I can't prove either. Let's not further undermine Christianity's credibility by demonizing one another. Instead, let's give each other the benefit of the doubt, believing the best about the other person, really loving each other. Let's show the world how productive dialogue is done. We have the same foundation. We should be able to reason with one another. We should be able to make moral progress together. This is what the world sorely needs right now, is reasonable dialogue. Let's be a light unto the world in this case. Which means that storytelling is not enough. The truths of that narrative must also correspond with reality. What is required is sound argumentation that tethers the narrative to the truth. For it's not as if there isn't any reason to think that the woke narrative is problematic. There's actually a lot of reasons to doubt it. Reasons that have been around, at least in written form, for decades, from the time it first reared its ugly head. To demonstrate that, let me just briefly consider one of the story's prevalent threads, the one which is the hot-button issue of the moment, that there is systemic bias in the criminal justice system. Let me try to dissect that for just a moment. Firstly, notice that this question is not asking whether individual instances of injustice occur. They do. Or whether there are too many of such instances. There are. In fact, one is too many. Or whether the police need to do more to purge their departments of bad cops. I tell you, if you talk to a police officer, they will tell you that they want to rid their departments of racist cops just as much as you do, in fact, probably more. The question is whether there is a system-wide bias. And again, it's not sufficient to simply say that we can infer this systemic bias from the fact that incarceration rates among blacks are way higher than whites. Once again, that's the non sequitur. And if we were to use such reasoning consistently, we would have to also then conclude that the criminal justice system is even more anti-male than it is anti-black, because only 10% of the prison population is female. I mean, imagine if I were to construct a moving narrative about how misandristic the criminal justice system is, that is to say, anti-male, but I refuse to back it up with anything other than anecdotal evidence, even if that anecdotal evidence was moving. Would it be just to then demand its acceptance by others? Would it be wise to base church reform and major government policy decisions upon it? To confirm systemic bias, one of the things that you need are good statistical studies, and these in fact have been done. But many of their findings don't support the woke theory. Let me give you just 3 recent major studies as examples, ones which even the New York Times was forced to cover. The first one was conducted in 2016 by Harvard economist Roland Fryer. The study examined more than 1,000 altercations between police and citizens in 10 major police departments in Texas, Florida, and California. And the results were shocking. In fact, Dr. Fryer called it the most surprising result of my career. What's so shocking? Well, it's shocking because the findings contradict the prevalent narrative that police are much more likely to shoot black suspects than white suspects due to systemic racism. The study, in fact, found that blacks are actually 27% less likely than whites to be shot at by the police, 27%. And such findings are not isolated. In a similar study conducted in 2019 for the National Academy of Sciences, researchers found that there is, quote, no significant evidence of anti-black disparity in the likelihood of being fatally shot by police, close quote. It's interesting, there are 209 million adults in the United States, at least as of 2019. And in all of 2019, the police only shot 28 unarmed suspects. In every incident, between an individual and the police, only 28 times were unarmed suspects shot. The majority of those were deemed justified shootings, by the way. Of the 28, only 9 were black. 9. Such results contradict the persistent messaging of many social influencers, some of which, by the way, financially benefit from the race hysteria that's produced. Individuals and organizations who relentlessly describe the current situation in hyperbolic language. The ACLU, for example, the American Civil Liberties Union, solicits donations with these words, quote, "Black people are being murdered and brutalized by police with near impunity." Now my question is if you're going to exaggerate that much, why bother with the word near? Why not just go for it? Or the title of civil rights attorney Ben Crump's recent book, Open Season, Legalized Genocide of Colored People. And of course, we could give thousands of similar examples from mainstream media. Such rhetoric, no doubt, terrifies people of color, and there have been studies done to demonstrate that terror. But the rhetoric finds little statistical basis in reality. Therefore, one would think that widely distributing these findings would work to allay much of the anxiety in the black community. But J.D. Greer, who is president of the Southern Baptist Convention, counsels us to spare each other of the quotating of stats right now. Which is, yeah, right. The last thing we need to do is inject a bunch of reality into the hysteria that's going on right now. A second issue, one which requires much further reflection, is the law enforcement practice of profiling. Many of the personal stories of injustice I have read and listened to over the last few weeks center on this issue. I have heard many moving accounts of black Christians being treated with greater suspicion and with little respect by the police, being pulled out of a car on a routine traffic stop and handcuffed and made to sit on the curb, which is a humiliating experience. It's an experience I've never had. And I've been pulled over going 100 miles an hour on the highway when I was much younger. My son's here. I've made a gigantic mistake by saying that. He's 18. But they were pulled out of the car in a routine traffic stop simply because they matched the vague description of a black male suspect. That's it. And there is statistical evidence that this profiling exists, that cops tend to get handsy with black suspects over minor violations with greater frequency than with white suspects. But this issue is a lot more complicated than it might first seem. For instance, just as there are different definitions of racism that we must keep in mind when we are trying to have a productive conversation, there are different kinds of profiling. Heather McDonald clarifies this distinction when she writes this: "What we call hard profiling uses race as the only factor in assessing criminal suspiciousness. An officer sees a black person and, without more to go on, pulls him over for a pat-down on the chance that he might be carrying drugs or weapons. Soft racial profiling is using race as one factor among others, engaging criminal suspiciousness. The highway police, for example, have intelligence that Jamaican drug posses, with a fondness for Nissan Pathfinders, are transporting drugs along the northeast corridor. A New Jersey trooper sees a black motorist speeding in a Pathfinder and pulls him over in the hope of finding drugs. The first of these kinds of profiling is illegal. The second is just good policing. However, hard profiling may not be as unethical as it initially sounds, the hard kind. For if it's the case that a particular race commits a far greater percentage of crime, especially in a given area, then it's not necessarily racism that is driving the profiling, but reason. And let me try to clarify that with an illustration. Is it unreasonable that when my 21-year-old daughter traveled to Israel, by the way, my daughter's name is Farah Azadeh Helgerson. Her mother is Iranian, born in Iran. Helgerson's the Iranian name, just kidding. Is it unreasonable that when she went to Israel, that she was harshly interrogated by the Israeli police for 6 hours in customs? Now you might think, as her father, I thought that such treatment was outrageous. Right? There is nothing in her profile to support that, or to suggest that she is a terrorist. I mean, she is an evangelical, for goodness sakes. We are Israel's biggest ally in the United States. If anything, they should be welcoming her with open arms. But I don't think that it was actually unreasonable. The country of Iran poses an imminent threat to the nation of Israel. And while it is certainly the case that most Iranians are not terrorists, the threat is present enough to justify such suspicion. It's not as if they denied her right to due process and threw her in prison. They interrogated her and let her go. But notice they were suspicious of her simply because of her ethnicity. Therefore, the discussion concerning profiling has many layers to it and must include the question of what level of suspicion is warranted given the present threat. Because I think everyone would accept at least some version of hard profiling if the threat is that imminent. In addition to this, does anyone really believe that if the percentage of crime committed by Black Americans dropped to the current level of, say, Jewish Americans, that these profiling practices would continue? The reason why Jewish Americans and Asian Americans and Indian Americans, etc., have less suspicion cast upon them is because these groups commit way fewer crimes. To deny this and to say, no, it's race instead, that's the definitive factor, requires further evidence. It's not something that can just be assumed. Again, my purpose is not to resolve the debate in this short sermon, but merely to show that open dialogue is called for, and to warn my fellow Christians to avoid the SJW style of rhetoric, which it seems is becoming more and more prevalent. For example, Beth Moore, all the women know who she is, Beth Moore recently tweeted this, quote, that we have somehow managed in the middle of a global pandemic and a worldwide outcry for justice in America to consume ourselves with theological armchair debates over critical race theory and the like is a testimony of how far we have shifted from Jesus Christ of Nazareth, close quote. Notice how manipulative this tweet is. She asserts her position as if it's the given, and then she threatens and shames us into not responding to it. I'm sorry, Miss Moore, but many of us have legitimate concerns regarding this particular race narrative, which need to be addressed. In fact, to demand that we change our mind without giving us sufficient reason is to dehumanize us. To try to get us just to surrender to your position and keep our mouths shut through shame or through threatening is a way of dehumanizing us. We have to be careful not to be guilty of committing the very sin that you are trying to eradicate, right? The kind of hypocrisy that is the subject of our text in Romans chapter 2, verse 1. We should also not forget that the 20th century was filled with terrible atrocities committed in the pursuit of justice, committed in the pursuit of fairness and equality and freedom. The wars that were waged in the 20th century did not begin by people saying, hey, let's just kill everyone, lawlessness. They were attempts at justice and fairness, equality and freedom. Certainly distorted views of those, but that was certainly their language. Declaring yourself to be on the side of justice doesn't make it so, in other words. In addition, I'm afraid that many of our brothers and sisters are naive to what the SJW movement is about. And because of this ignorance, they can easily be used by the ideology to tear apart the church. These people, the SJW movement people, are masters at weaponizing empathy. And who has more empathy than Christians? They also appeal to people who are self-righteous, and let's be honest, who has more Pharisees than the church? I think in both accounts we are uniquely susceptible to this particular movement. Now, in future sermons, we will discuss the ideology which underlies all of this madness, what some have called cultural Marxism, which, make no mistake, is a religion. one which has many denominations, and one which is profoundly anti-Christian. And thus it represents a clear and present danger to the church. In fact, perhaps it is our greatest foe at this age. It is a stronghold that must be torn down. And so let me conclude with that. I will say this, if you want to learn more about this particular issue, one thing that you can do is, if you're on Facebook, send me a friend request. Because what I do is, as I research things, I make links to that information on my Facebook page. So if you scroll through my personal Facebook page, you will find a lot of articles and videos on this very subject.